This epic tale unfolds not amidst the clash of battle cries or the sight of burning ships, but begins with a single apple, gleaming pure gold. Carelessly tossed into the heart of a grand celebration, it instantly wove itself into the fabric of a great legend, becoming the spark that ignited a decade-long war. The narrative transports listeners to a world where mighty gods walked alongside mortals, where the fates of kings were entangled by unbreakable oaths, and where a single, seemingly insignificant decision could determine the course of a devastating 10-year war. This was not yet the Greece of polished marble temples and profound philosophers. No, this was an older, more mysterious age of myths and legends, when the shadows of great heroes stretched vast, and the Olympian deities still brazenly interfered with every step of humanity, guiding or distorting its path. The narrative invites you to prepare for a slow unfolding of events, delving into the past precisely from that pivotal moment when the chain of events leading to the Trojan War was set in motion, when the fateful mechanism began its relentless count. The true genesis of the story lies not in bloody battles but in a grand celebration, a divine wedding whose scale demanded golden goblets, melodic celestial harpists, and a feast so magnificent that mortals were, of course, forbidden entry. The setting was a space stretched between the majestic heavens and the boundless wine-dark sea. Here the union of the mortal king Peleus and Thetis, a sea nymph whose beauty was as extraordinary as her temperament was unpredictable, was forged. Today she could calm raging waves, and tomorrow transform into a furious, fire-breathing lioness, demonstrating the changeability and elusiveness characteristic of deep-sea dwellers. This wedding distinguished itself from any mortal celebration not only by its splendor, but also by its guest list. The Olympian gods themselves graced it with their presence. Mighty Zeus, majestic Hera, wise Athena, golden-haired Apollo, and even Dionysus, who undoubtedly arrived in anticipation of abundant wine and inevitable drama. The reason for such an unusual union lay in an ancient prophecy, which foretold that Thetis's child would one day surpass its parent in strength and power. Naturally, the gods, being celestial rulers constantly wary of competition, did not wish to raise a demigod capable of potentially overthrowing them. Thus, they wisely, or cunningly, decided to marry her off to a mortal. The lucky man bestowed with this honor was Peleus, a sufficiently respected warrior who likely didn't inquire too deeply into the true motives behind the divine decision. It was at this point that the celebration began to take on the ominous shape of impending disaster. The fact was, one deity had been left uninvited to this momentous occasion. This uninvited guest was Eris, the mischievous goddess of strife, discord, and all manner of inconvenience. Scorned and seething with rage from the slight, Eris acted as her malevolent nature dictated. She showed up at the feast anyway and presented her special gift, a golden apple, dazzlingly bright and alluring in its flawless beauty, upon whose surface were engraved 3 concise but fateful words, "To the fairest." Tossing it into the very centre of the festive hall, she watched as an instant, deathly silence fell, then likely departed with a satisfied, sardonic smirk. One might naively assume that the omnipotent gods of Olympus were above superficial squabbles over a shiny fruit. However, no. All divine decorum abandoned the feasting hall with dizzying speed as if Hermes himself had rushed off on urgent business. 3 majestic goddesses immediately laid claim to the golden apple: Hera, the imperious queen of Olympus and patroness of marriage; Athena, the wise goddess of war and strategic art, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, unfading beauty, and as it turned out, unparalleled skill in complicating human and divine destinies. Each genuinely believed herself the rightful owner of the prize, and each, in her own way, was sufficiently awe-inspiring and formidable to make the others question their own claims. Faced with this unprecedented celestial beauty contest, the gods did what many bureaucratic systems often do when caught in a no-win situation. They offloaded the burden of decision onto someone else. Their choice fell upon Paris, a prince of Troy, a man whose subsequent decisions would demonstrate that prudence was not his most distinguishing characteristic. At that time, he was living a humble life as a shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida. Having been secretly removed from royal life as a child due to a prophecy foretelling that he would one day cause Troy's downfall, his family had, naturally, decided to abandon him in infancy, just in case. Nevertheless, he grew up handsome and healthy, but, far more importantly, utterly unprepared to judge a divine contest. The three goddesses appeared before Paris not in mortal modesty, but in all their dazzling divine majesty, and each offered him a distinct gift in exchange for the coveted apple. Hera promised him boundless power, dominion over all of Asia. Athena offered wisdom and invincibility in battle, but Aphrodite, ever astute in discerning hidden desires, promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, guided by youthful ardor rather than the sober calculation of a geopolitical strategist, awarded the apple to Aphrodite, and so, by the whim of one young man, the world stood on the precipice of an all-consuming fire. The possessor of that ethereal beauty promised to Paris was Helen, Queen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and leader, and by some accounts, Nemesis. Many powerful Greek kings vied for her hand, and once they almost plunged into a bloody internecine conflict over her. To prevent conflict, her mortal father, King Tyndareus, compelled all suitors without exception to swear a solemn oath that they would respect Helen's choice, and if anyone ever dared to abduct her, they would all unite to retrieve her. This was an early but highly indicative example of what would later become a complex geopolitical knot, waiting for its moment. Ultimately, Helen chose Menelaus, a competent, if not particularly brilliant, ruler of Sparta. They married, and for a time a fragile peace settled upon their lives. This peace lasted precisely until Paris arrived at the Spartan court under the guise of a diplomatic visit. Then, encouraged by the cunning Aphrodite, he either skillfully seduced Helen or brazenly abducted her. Different sources interpret her role in this event differently. In Homer's famous Iliad, Helen appears as a tormented, repentant, and passive victim of circumstances, whereas in Euripides' versions she exhibits far greater resolve. Later poets even put forth a bold hypothesis claiming that it was not Helen herself who went to Troy, but merely her ethereal phantom, while the true queen remained in Egypt, like a pawn in someone's grand game, awaiting her move. Regardless of the chosen interpretation, the outcome remained unchanged. Paris returned to Troy with Helen, and Menelaus, consumed by uncontrollable fury and a profound sense of insult, called upon every king, prince, and warrior who had once sworn to defend his wife's honor. It is at this juncture that the great myth begins to intersect with tangible history. Scholars have debated for centuries whether the Trojan War truly occurred in reality. Was there a genuine conflict between the Mycenaean Greeks and a city located on the Anatolian coast? A city that might have been called Wilusa, whose name bears a striking resemblance to Ilion, another well-known name for Troy. Archaeological excavations at Hisarlik Hill, the presumed site of legendary Troy, demonstrate that the city was repeatedly destroyed by fire and sword. Vibrant trade routes passed through this strategically important region, promising fabulous wealth and, consequently, inevitably leading to numerous conflicts. Thus, while the gods may not have hurled their gleaming spears from Olympus, someone undoubtedly hurled something more tangible over those ancient walls. Returning to the threads of myth, the Greeks began to muster their forces. Agamemnon, the mighty king of Mycenae and brother of the wronged Menelaus, assumed supreme command. The reason for this was not out of particular love or popularity, far from it, but because he possessed an immense fleet, countless swords, and wielded a rather commanding voice. Other renowned kings answered his call, the cunning and resourceful Odysseus, the verbose and experienced Nestor, the mighty and taciturn warrior Ajax, and of course the most famous of all, Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, the very couple whose wedding had initially served as the starting point for this entire chain of tragic events. Achilles was a formidable warrior prince, raised by the wise centaur Chiron and trained to be the unparalleled warrior of his age. His mother, foreseeing his early demise, immersed the infant in the sacred waters of the river Styx to render him invulnerable to any weapon, save for the single point, the heel by which she held him, thereby gifting the world the metaphor of a vulnerable spot. However, not every hero was eager to join the impending war. Odysseus, renowned for his cunning and strategic mind, feigned madness to avoid parting with his young son. He yoked an ox and a donkey to a plough and began sowing salt in his fields, simulating insanity, until another cunning Greek placed his infant directly in the plough's path. Odysseus instinctively swerved, thereby irrefutably proving his sanity, and was promptly dispatched to the war. Achilles, too, was hidden. He was secreted away, disguised in maiden's clothes, among the daughters of King Lycomedes. This cunning plan held until Odysseus delivered a selection of trinkets and a weapon, laying them before the maidens. Achilles, obeying his true nature, instinctively reached for the sword, thereby revealing his identity. Thus the legendary 1,000 ships were assembled, and it seemed the winds were about to fill their sails. However, in the port of Aulis, the fleet found itself completely becalmed. The gods, as is known, were not so easily manipulated. Artemis, the powerful goddess of the hunt, was deeply offended, likely by Agamemnon, who had either rashly boasted of his hunting prowess or sacrilegiously killed a sacred deer. As a result, she demanded a terrible price for her wrath, the sacrifice of his own daughter, the young Iphigenia. This was one of those dramatic moments when Greek myth sharply pivots from lavish splendor to bottomless tragedy. Agamemnon naturally hesitated, but ultimately lust for power and a yearning for glory triumphed over paternal love. Iphigenia was lured to Aulis under the false pretense of marriage to the great Achilles, and there she was sacrificed. Though some versions offer a softer ending, claiming that Artemis, at the last moment, whisked her away in a cloud, leaving a sacred deer on the altar, most traditions explicitly state that Agamemnon himself killed his daughter, and only then did the winds begin to blow, marking a grim and ominous portent for the coming decade-long war. And so, with divine grievances at their zenith, ancient oaths called to be fulfilled, and personal tragedies multiplying by the minute, the legendary 1,000 ships set forth on their fateful journey to Troy. They sailed, utterly unaware that they were destined to spend a full decade there, paying the price for their hubris and thirst for vengeance, let alone knowing that by the war's end, almost all of them would be dead, disgraced, or doomed to eternal wandering across the seas. But that is a narrative for the next gripping chapter. For now, one might rest briefly, for even the grandest and bloodiest war in myths began not with a sharp sword, but with a lavish wedding, a profound insult, and a single golden apple. Now, having delved into the divine chaos born from a golden apple and the ambitions of goddesses, attention shifts to the woman who, some say, launched 1,000 ships. Perhaps this is merely poetic exaggeration, for poets whose nature was not one of restraint were prone to hyperbole, but it is fair to acknowledge that Helen of Sparta, and later of Troy, was at the very epicenter of the unfolding storm. Helen's life story, as ancient traditions recount, began even before her birth, which in itself portended an extraordinary and at times unsettling destiny. Her mother, Leda, was the reigning queen of Sparta. One ordinary day, the mighty Zeus, known for his tireless propensity for earthly liaisons and the most persistent of all Olympians, noticed the queen from the heavens. As was often his divine practice, he decided to seduce her. However, instead of appearing in his true, radiant, sometimes lightning-wielding form as a deity, he chose a most peculiar transformation, taking the guise of a swan, for naturally, that is precisely what he did. The result of this most unusual and mystical encounter, according to various mythological accounts, was the appearance of either one or several eggs. Yes, that's right. Leda, the queen, laid eggs. Ancient myths, as quickly becomes apparent, have a particular fondness for the strange and unusual, while showing very limited interest in matters of mundane plausibility. From these peculiar eggs emerged Helen, and sometimes, depending on the tale, her brothers Castor and Pollux, and her sister Clytemnestra, who would later play a very significant role as events in Greece began to take a tragic turn. But for now, Helen grew up, surrounded by royal luxury and attention. From infancy, she was a true marvel. Her beauty was not merely earthly, it possessed, so the legends claim, a divine radiance. This beauty was so dazzling that men involuntarily sighed at her sight. Women whispered, and mighty kings began to act quite recklessly. When Helen came of age, her hand was sought by virtually every noble and worthy man in the entire Hellenic world. Among her many suitors were distinguished warriors, noble princes, and powerful kings, including legendary figures like Odysseus, Ajax, and Menelaus. There were so many that her mortal father, King Tyndareus, reasonably feared. Whoever he chose as a son-in-law, the remaining contenders would almost certainly feel slighted, wage war, and quite likely cause considerable disruption on their way home. Therefore, following the wise counsel of Odysseus, who was always strategically minded, Tyndareus compelled all suitors to swear a binding oath, the famous Oath of Tyndareus. They all unanimously agreed to respect Helen's choice and, more importantly, to defend her chosen husband if anyone ever tried to take her from him. It was an exceedingly clever solution, which, as often happens with ingenious strategies in Greek myths, was destined to turn into a grand and catastrophic failure. Helen made her choice in favor of Menelaus, Agamemnon's brother and the future king of Sparta. Menelaus was a competent man, possessed considerable wealth, and commanded widespread respect. He wasn't particularly charismatic, but his presence couldn't simply be ignored. He was the type of man who meticulously polished his own armor and expected others to notice. Helen and Menelaus were married, and for a time, their lives proceeded smoothly. They had a daughter, Hermione, settled into their lavish Spartan palace, and peacefully ruled their well-ordered kingdom. But then Paris intruded upon their lives. Paris, son of Priam and Hecuba of Troy, had been raised not as a prince, but as a humble shepherd. It was a common trope in myths for someone's birth to be accompanied by an unsettling prophecy. In Paris's case, the prophecy was quite specific and rather ominous. He was destined to cause the downfall of Troy. So naturally, his parents did what any responsible monarch would do. They abandoned him in the wilderness. Unfortunately for them, Paris survived. Raised among shepherds, he grew into a man of striking beauty, but with rather limited foresight. Eventually, he was accepted back into the royal family, the prophecy likely forgotten in the general excitement. Soon after, he was dispatched on a diplomatic mission to Greece, officially to establish friendly relations, but unofficially with the secret aim of stirring up conflict. When Paris arrived in Sparta, Menelaus received him quite hospitably, proving himself a gracious host by Greek standards, which typically involved offering food, wine, and no attempts to stab anyone. However, Menelaus was soon called away to a funeral, forcing him to leave the palace. Paris, ever opportunistic and heavily influenced by Aphrodite, who had promised him the love of the world's most beautiful woman, seized the king's absence. Whether Helen was a willing accomplice or a victim of divine manipulation is one of the greatest ambiguities of ancient myth. Homer's Iliad portrays her as a conflicted figure, experiencing shame and deep thoughtfulness, but not overtly coerced. Later tragedians such as Euripides grant her more agency, or, conversely, strip her of it entirely, depending on the overall tone of the work. Some versions, for instance in Euripides' play, Helen, go so far as to assert that she never even went to Troy, that Paris abducted only a phantom image, while the real Helen remained in Egypt, as bewildered as everyone else. However, the most common version states that Helen departed with Paris, sailing across the Aegean Sea to Troy, leaving behind her husband, her child, and far more importantly, the oath that bound all her former suitors. When Menelaus returned to find his wife gone and his honor publicly trampled, he did not mourn in silence. He called for the oath to be fulfilled. Heralds were dispatched throughout Greece, summoning the kings. Ancient alliances were reawakened. Even those long retired from warfare were now bound by a sacred promise. And what a gathering of heroes it was. Agamemnon, the mighty king of Mycenae, assumed command of the united host. He was ambitious, proud, and did not hesitate to sacrifice his own daughter when the winds refused to blow. But that tragic story has already been alluded to. Odysseus, ever cunning, tried to evade participation in the war. He had a young son, a clever wife, and absolutely no interest in foreign adventures. So he feigned madness, ploughing his fields with salt. But when Greek agents placed his infant, Telemachus, directly in front of the plough, Odysseus sharply swerved, thereby proving his sanity and sealing his fate. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his age, also resisted. His mother, the sea nymph Thetis, hid him on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes. Why? Because it was prophesied that if Achilles went to war, he would never return. But again, Odysseus found a solution. He laid out gifts for the maidens, combs, bracelets, mirrors, and one sword. Achilles, of course, chose the weapon, predictable yet highly effective. In time, a vast army was assembled. Ships were readied. Legend has it there were 1,000 of them, and the greatest force the Greek world had ever known gathered under Agamemnon's banner. However, before they sailed, they needed a good omen. You see, the Greeks took omens very seriously. The gods didn't send text messages, but they did send birds. At Aulis, a serpent appeared and devoured 9 sparrows before turning to stone. The seer Calchas declared that this signified the war would last 9 years, and Troy would fall in the 10th. One can imagine troop morale took a slight hit. Nevertheless, the Greeks commenced their expedition, but they didn't immediately find Troy. First, they accidentally attacked Teuthania, a city that, unfortunately, bore a strong resemblance to Troy. Geography, as it turned out, was not the Greeks' strong suit. Eventually, they reached Troy and established their camp on the coast outside the city's formidable walls. These walls, according to myth, had been built by Apollo and Poseidon themselves, disguised as mortals, when they were temporarily punished to serve King Laomedon. So they were, to put it mildly, incredibly robust. This would not be a swift war. In Troy, Helen was received not as a captive, but as a queen. Priam, the aging king, treated her kindly. His son Hector, the city's greatest warrior, was courteous, if somewhat disapproving. The city, for all its splendor, had become a cage for her. Helen was now the face of a conflict over which she had little control, revered and blamed in equal measure. One can imagine the whispers she heard. In the Iliad, she is at once self-aware and self-loathing. "Oh, if only I had died before following your son here," she tells Priam. And yet, she remained. The war began not with the falling of towers, but with raids. Unable to breach Troy's formidable walls, the Greeks resorted to raiding Trojan allies, cities along the coast, seizing supplies, enslaving women, and burning anything they couldn't carry. It was this pattern, campaign, retreat, rest, that defined the first 9 years of the war. During one such raid, the Greeks captured 2 women whose names would later ignite a grand calamity. One was Chryseis, daughter of a Trojan priest of Apollo. She was awarded to Agamemnon. The other was Briseis, assigned to Achilles. They were not spoils in the sense of common military trophies. They were grimly taken as concubines. And the gods, as it turned out, were watching closely. When Chryseis' father pleaded for her return, and Agamemnon haughtily refused, Apollo, god of plague, archery, and sometimes poetic justice, unleashed a pestilence upon the Greek camp. Soldiers began to die. Animals perished. The air grew foul with the smell of decay. Eventually, Agamemnon conceded, though not without a burst of rage. He returned Chryseis to her father, yes, but demanded Briseis from Achilles as compensation. This, to put it mildly, was a catastrophic error. Achilles, already simmering with wounded pride, withdrew from the war. He refused to fight. He refused to speak. He even refused to look at Agamemnon, save for sidelong, contemptuous glances. The mightiest Greek warrior had now retreated, sulking, some said, but in truth, deeply wounded in the very core of his honor. In the heroic code of those times, honor was more vital than the strongest armor. To be publicly shamed was not merely an insult. It was a soul-crushing blow. Greek morale faltered. They pressed against the city, but without Achilles, they found themselves in dire straits. Hector, conversely, surged forward, rallying the Trojan forces and driving the Greeks back to their ships. Fierce skirmishes erupted, chariots rumbled, shields splintered under blows, yet Troy's impregnable walls still held. But let us step back for a moment and consider what this war truly looked like. Not in poetry, but in Bronze Age terms. This was not trench warfare, nor mass armies of uniformed soldiers. It was chariots, short swords, and throwing spears. Bronze, not iron. Armor was heavy and individualized. Battles were small-scale and often featured duels between champions, watched by spectators. Imagine rugby with a lot more stabbing. War was also a ritual. Before battle, warriors delivered speeches, sometimes to their enemies, boasting of their lineage, deeds, and divine favor. Afterward, they stripped the dead of their armor and weapons, which were both valuable and symbolic. And yet, amidst the stylized duels and epic speeches, there was real loss. Entire cities ruined, sons who never returned, women enslaved. The songs remember the heroes, but the silence belongs to the nameless dead. Silence. The Iliad, a grand narrative spanning only a brief period in the 10th year of the war, lifts the veil on a moment of profound stalemate and inexpressible grief. It is during this period that we witness the emergence of the full cast of characters. Ajax the Great, whose massive shield-bearing figure resembled an unyielding moving wall. Diomedes, whose valor on the battlefield was so great that he dared to wound Ares himself. And of course, Nestor, the venerable elder whose counsel, so lengthy and verbose it seemed it could outlast even the fiercest battles, resonated within the Greek camp. And of course the gods. Ah, these gods! They were far from being detached, neutral observers. On the contrary, they actively took sides, engaged in fierce disputes, wove intrigues, and at times even personally intervened in the course of battle. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon championed the valiant Greeks, while Apollo, Aphrodite, and Ares consistently supported the Trojans. Zeus, nominally maintaining neutrality, tried in vain to uphold some semblance of order, but his efforts met with spectacular failure. The gods quarrelled no less than mortals, and perhaps even more so. They threw truly divine tantrums, manipulated human destinies, and sometimes, disguised as ordinary soldiers, intervened to sway the outcome of events. Indeed, the Olympians were the original micromanagers. Meanwhile, on the ground, the bloody war continued its course. The Greeks, gripped by despair over Achilles' absence, attempted a diplomatic resolution. They dispatched an embassy to his tent. Odysseus, Phoenix, and Ajax arrived with lavish offers of treasures, sincere apologies, and even the promise of Briseis' return. However, Achilles, brooding in his tent, staunchly refused all offers, his refusal dictated not by whim, but by deep principle. His honor had been trampled, and in the world of heroic warriors, honor was tantamount to life itself. Nevertheless, even Achilles could not entirely ignore the unfolding events. Hector, a bold and commanding leader, spearheaded a powerful Trojan offensive, driving the Greeks back to their ships. Fires began to spread everywhere. For a moment it seemed Troy might win not by guile or strength, but by pure, unyielding tenacity. This was a turning point, when the war began to change its inner character, a moment when the greatest heroes on both sides stood on the brink, not yet in their climactic clash, but already fully revealed. The Greeks were entrenched, the Trojans advancing, and Helen watched from the walls, her fate and the fates of all others still unwritten. The siege had begun. The city walls stood tall, but something deeper was beginning to crumble. Trust, pride, and the thin threads connecting king to king. So the 10th year dawned, Achilles in silence, Agamemnon humbled, and Hector ascendant. In the next chapter, these fissures would deepen. The war, until now smouldering, would begin to boil. But for now, rest easy, dear listener. The ships are still anchored, the fires still smouldering, and the gods have not yet cast their final lots. When people envision the Trojan War, their imaginations often conjure a continuous roar of battle, gleaming swords, shouting heroes, and gods hurling lightning from the heavens. But the truth, if such a thing exists in mythology, is a little less cinematic and far more protracted. For 9 long years, a full 9, this war dragged on in such a grim, grinding manner that it would test the patience of even the most enthusiastic poet. The siege was not constant battles, but a war of attrition, characterized by raids, starvation, disease, and occasional divine tantrums. And perhaps that is why the Trojan War lives on through the ages, not merely because of the final blow, the horse, the fire, the fall, but because it reflects something profoundly human, a grand idea that, once set in motion, no one can stop, a war fought for honor that slowly becomes anything but. Back to the shore. The Greeks had set up their camp along the coastline, sprawling like a market left too long under a scorching sun. Their ships were drawn ashore and securely fortified behind a wall of stakes and trenches. They had everything needed for a short war, which, naturally, meant they were utterly unprepared for a long one. Troy's mighty walls held firm, and the Trojans rarely dared to venture beyond them. Every attempt to storm the city ended in bloodshed and deep frustration. And so, for much of those 9 years, the Greeks did what they could. They raided the surrounding countryside, plundering cities loyal to Troy, seizing food, livestock, gold, and, most tragically, women. These women were taken as concubines, slaves, bargaining chips. War, for all its heroic verses, was also brutally transactional. And that is how Briseis and Chryseis entered the story. 2 women, caught in the tide of war, given to men as prizes and ultimately used to fuel the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles, as we mentioned earlier. But the fissures ran deeper than a single quarrel. Beneath the polished speeches and bronze breastplates, the Greek coalition was beginning to fray. Agamemnon's leadership, though militarily sound, was unpopular. He had a knack for taking more than his share of the spoils and offering less than his share of credit. Kings like Odysseus, Diomedes, and Ajax often found themselves having to balance obedience with their own ambitions and growing exasperation. Achilles, for his part, had completely withdrawn from the war. His pride was wounded, his honor insulted. He refused to fight. For much of these years he spent his time in his tent, sharpening his weapons, practicing on his lyre, and generally being a brooding symbol of Bronze Age masculinity. Meanwhile, the Trojans were not idle. While the Greeks ravaged the countryside, the Trojans forged new alliances. Reinforcements arrived from neighboring kingdoms, the Lycians, the Phrygians, and others whose names have been lost to time. Among them was a warrior named Sarpedon, a son of Zeus, who fought with such quiet dignity that he would later inspire even his enemies. Inside Troy, tensions mounted. People suffered. Food grew scarce. Supplies from the interior were cut off by Greek patrols. And yet the walls held, a symbol of resilience against overwhelming odds. As the war dragged on, both sides increasingly relied on divine favor, or at least the illusion of it. The Greeks offered sacrifices to Athena, Hera, and Poseidon. The Trojans appealed to Apollo, Aphrodite, and Artemis. The gods, it must be said, behaved much like mortals, bickering, sulking, favoring some, and occasionally bursting onto the battlefield in disguise. Later, poets whisper a tale of a duel between Menelaus and Paris early in the war. The idea was simple: settle it one-on-one. One duel, one outcome, fewer funerals. The duel was arranged. Menelaus, understandably enraged, fought with a fury born of righteous indignation. Paris, less heroic and more foppish, was quickly overwhelmed. As Menelaus prepared to deliver the killing blow, Aphrodite intervened, snatching Paris from the battlefield and depositing him back in his chambers with Helen, who by this point was growing increasingly weary of such absurdities. It's worth noting that Aphrodite didn't ask anyone's permission. She simply decided, rather like an indulgent parent, that her favoured son had suffered enough. Menelaus, meanwhile, stood in the dust, sword raised, wondering what on earth had just happened. The war, it seemed, would not be settled by honour. There were, of course, moments of glory. One of the brightest stars of this middle period was Diomedes, king of Argos, who fought with such relentless precision that even the gods took notice. At one point, Diomedes, aided by Athena, who temporarily granted him the ability to see gods on the battlefield, wounded Aphrodite herself. Yes, a mortal man drew the blood of a goddess. It was, frankly, an embarrassing moment for her. She fled to Olympus, bleeding and wailing, and Zeus gently implied that perhaps war was not the best arena for one whose primary weapon was a love charm. Later, Diomedes even wounded Ares, the god of war. Ares, in turn, did what all warriors fear most. He complained to his father. Zeus, unimpressed, told him to stop dramatizing and get back to business. These episodes, while entertaining, tell us something deeper. The war had become so entangled, so protracted, that the divine and mortal realms began to merge. The gods were not distant, silent observers. They were literally in the thick of it, sulking, scheming, bleeding. Yet even as heroes fell and cities burned, the war refused to end. Like an unwelcome guest, it overstayed its welcome. In the Greek camp, Achilles remained absent from the battlefield, a decision that continued to cost the Greeks dearly. Without him, morale plummeted. Hector led increasingly daring assaults. Greek casualties mounted. Even Odysseus struggled to keep the ranks focused, though he tried his best, sometimes with cunning, sometimes with wine. It was in this atmosphere of decay and distrust that treachery took root. You might recall Palamedes, the clever man who exposed Odysseus's feigned madness early in the war. Well, Odysseus, always playing the long game, never forgot. According to later accounts, Odysseus framed Palamedes as a traitor, forging a letter and planting gold to make it appear he was taking bribes from the Trojans. The Greeks, perhaps too eager for a scapegoat, simply executed him. One of the best minds among them, gone, a moment that illustrates the true cost of war. Not just lives, but trust. Not just cities, but virtue. The longer it continued, the more it demanded. Not just heroes, but their humanity. And the Greeks, once bound by a noble oath, began to unravel further. Agamemnon's arrogance grated. Achilles' silence loomed. Even Nestor's endless stories began to sound less like wisdom and more like noise. As for Helen, her gaze remained fixed from the walls of the besieged city. Her unfading beauty, like a living banner, had become a potent symbol, deeply etched into the minds of the warring factions. To the Hellenes she embodied a stolen sanctity, the object of their unyielding wrath. At the same time, for the Trojans, she represented that which they adamantly refused to renounce. Helen herself was captive between legend and personal memory, between fervent affections and burning hatred. In the epic poem, the Iliad, she expresses deep remorse, calling herself a dog, the ultimate expression of shame, and agonizingly wondering if some curse lay upon her. It is fitting to suggest that she, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, understood the true nature of this war, not as a chronicle of heroic deeds, but as a slowly unfolding, heartbreaking tragedy. Thus concluded the 9th year of this grueling siege. The Achaeans, depleted and fractured, nonetheless continued to hold the coastline. The Trojans, battered by countless battles and isolated, still staunchly defended their city. The Olympian gods, mending both physical wounds and bruised pride, still interfered in events guided by their whims. And Achilles, the greatest of warriors, still remained in his tent, steeped in silence, consumed by wrath, and refusing to yield, not only to Agamemnon, not only to the war itself, but even to predetermined fate. Yet something subtle was already beginning to shift. For in the Greek camp, a young man named Patroclus watched the flickering campfires intently, and very soon, extraordinarily soon, that barely smouldering ember would ignite into an unprecedented blaze. If war had a pulse, it would not be found in the clang of bronze weapons or the thunder of chariot wheels. Rather, it would be a held breath, frozen between a deed done and its inevitable consequence, that very ominous silence foreshadowing something truly dreadful. This is how we approach the very heart of the Iliad, not the origins of the Trojan War, nor its conclusion, but a unique temporal segment in the 10th year of the conflict, when the pride of a single man was destined to alter the entire course of events. His name, of course, was Achilles, son of Peleus, the mortal king, and Thetis, the sea nymph, who, as is known, held the threads of fate firmly in her grasp. Achilles grew up with a clear awareness of his exceptional nature and his predetermined doom. Traditions held that 2 paths lay before him, either a long life devoid of glory, or a short one whose echo would reverberate through countless ages. He, without hesitation, chose the path leading to that eternal echo. However, no one warns that glory itself is rarely truly glorious in the moment it is lived. Often it turns into loneliness, breeds irritation, and is surrounded by people utterly incapable of understanding you. At the very beginning of the period described, Achilles had completely withdrawn from combat. His conflict with Agamemnon, stemming from the slave girl Briseis, plunged him into such a deep and legendary peak that the story entirely occupies the first book of Homer's Iliad. However, to call it merely a peak would be to miss its true encompassing depth. Achilles was not simply in a bad mood. He had been subjected to public, unbearable humiliation. In a warrior society where the concept of honor was valued as highly as life itself, Agamemnon had effectively stripped him of both. The fact was, when Agamemnon was forced to return Chryseis to stop the plague sent by Apollo, he decided to take Briseis from Achilles as a form of compensation, as if an exchange of women could serve as a means to uphold warrior morale. By doing so, he grossly violated an unwritten but sacred code accepted among heroes. A trophy acquired by a warrior, however grim its acquisition, was an embodiment of his dignity. Agamemnon's act was tantamount to him taking Achilles' shield and deliberately spitting on it. Surprisingly, Achilles responded to the insult not with his customary violence, but with complete disengagement. He retreated to his tent, adamantly refusing to participate in battles or even engage in dialogue with Agamemnon. And as he remained in his brooding thoughts, the tide of war outside his sanctuary began to shift rapidly. In Achilles' absence, the Trojans surged forward with renewed vigor. Hector, noble and tireless warrior, led one assault after another. The Achaeans, caught between incompetent leadership and constant divine interference, began inexorably losing ground. Skirmishes escalated into a full rout. Even mighty Ajax was forced to retreat. At one point, the Trojan forces reached the Greek ships, the very beachhead the Achaeans had held for nearly a decade. Achilles watched from the sidelines, utterly disengaged. Perhaps this is the most striking part of the Iliad. The defining action of its greatest hero was precisely inaction. For many pages he sits, seething with internal rage, not because he lacks courage, but because he fundamentally refuses to grant Agamemnon the satisfaction of his return to battle. One could argue this serves as a lesson in how dangerous pride becomes when mixed with unshakable principles, or perhaps how easily the gods can bring down even the best of men. Meanwhile, Agamemnon, quite uncharacteristically for his arrogant nature, succumbed to panic. With the belated realization that the withdrawal of their greatest warrior had severe consequences, he offered a substantial ransom. Untold treasures, noble horses, entire cities, and even the return of Briseis, untouched, as if Achilles should now feel grateful. He even swore an oath, though Agamemnon rarely swore oaths, except perhaps to himself in the mirror. The embassy dispatched to convey these belated apologies consisted of the most persuasive and revered among the Greeks: Odysseus, always distinguished by his eloquence; Ajax, consistently demonstrating his physical might; and Phoenix, Achilles' old mentor, sent in the hope that paternal counsel might succeed where diplomacy had utterly failed. And so, at last, the emissaries entered Achilles' tent. There they found the great hero gently plucking the strings of his lyre, engaged not in preparing for battle, but in making music. It was a reminder, as it were, that even the most formidable warriors possessed a deep inner life. They presented their compelling arguments, appeals to glory, to honor, to the urgent needs of all Greece. But Achilles replied with a categorical no, not with blazing fury, but with unshakable, quiet conviction. He spoke of the futility of war, of the profound insults dealt by Agamemnon, and of how no amount of gold could atone for pride once lost. Furthermore, he dared to question the heroic code itself. Why should he give his life for a man who despises him? What value has glory if it is bought with one's own life? It is at this point that Achilles ceases to be merely a warrior. He becomes a living embodiment of a question. What is heroism worth if it condemns one to suffer at the hands of fools? What is victory if to achieve it one must lose oneself? And he remained adamant. The embassy returned empty-handed, and the war, meanwhile, grew increasingly bloody. At that critical juncture, with the Greek camp nearly ablaze and the Trojans emboldened beyond measure, Patroclus stepped forward. Ah yes, Patroclus, the loyal friend, the devoted companion, the brother in arms. Some even hint at a deeper bond. However, in the Homeric world, the precise nature of their relationship yields in significance to its immense emotional weight. Patroclus was to Achilles like a heart living outside his body, and he could no longer passively watch his countrymen perish. He implored Achilles, "Let me enter the battle in your stead. Let me don your armor. Let the Trojans believe you have returned. Perhaps then they will retreat." Achilles gave his consent, but with one categorical condition. Only drive them from the ships. Do not dare pursue them to the city gates. Patroclus donned the gleaming god-forged armor, unmistakably Achilles' panoply, and led the Myrmidons into the decisive fray. And the maneuver worked. The Trojans, convinced of Achilles' return, seized by panic, turned and fled. Patroclus, meanwhile, fought with astonishing skill, ferociously and with a good measure of recklessness. He struck down warrior after warrior, including Sarpedon, son of Zeus himself, causing such grief that even the Olympian gods debated the wisdom of their intervention. However, Patroclus, swept up in the fervour of battle, completely forgot his promise. He drove the Trojans all the way to the walls of Troy, and it was there that Hector met him. Two great warriors clashed in a deadly encounter, spear against sword, Trojan prince against Achaean hero. Ultimately, Hector delivered the fatal blow to Patroclus, unaware of his true identity until the helmet fell from his head. Patroclus's death was a shock not only to Achilles, but to all the Greeks, to the Trojans, and even to the Celestials. Yet no one felt that loss as acutely and profoundly as Achilles. Upon hearing the terrible news, he collapsed, struck down by unbearable grief. He wept inconsolably, tore at his hair, covered his body with ash, and writhed in the dust, demonstrating the full extent of his despair. His immense pride, his stubborn refusal to engage in battle, his burning wrath, all of it first turned inward, tormenting his soul. And then, with unstoppable force, it erupted outwards. Thus began the great wrath of Achilles. It would be magnificent. It would be unimaginably terrible, and it would be unstoppable. Achilles' first order of business was to seek new armor, for his old set now rested upon the fallen Patroclus. His mother, the sea nymph Thetis, rose from the ocean depths and went to Hephaestus, the divine smith, who forged an entirely new set of gear for Achilles. The bronze was so exquisitely crafted that it literally glowed. The shield, moreover, was so vast that it depicted the entire cosmos, with all its stars and constellations. These were not mere armour, they were fate itself, clad in martial splendour. Then Achilles re-entered the bloody fray. The Achaeans, seeing his return, let out a triumphant roar of hope. The Trojans, conversely, seeing him, trembled with terror. The gods watched from their heights, some with awe, others with genuine fear. For they knew well, when Achilles was in his wrath, he ceased to be human. He became a raging storm. He cut through the Trojan ranks like fire devouring dry straw. He fought not for fleeting glory, but for burning grief. Not for Agamemnon, but for his beloved Patroclus. He drove the Trojans to the city walls, relentlessly killing everyone in his path. He even engaged in combat with the river god Scamander, who, in a rage, tried to drown him because of the countless corpses choking his waters. Even the gods had to pull Achilles from the turbulent stream. And finally, he came face to face with Hector. This fateful duel we will detail further in the next chapter, for it certainly deserves its own comprehensive narrative. But for now, let us return to Achilles' tent. Where once his brooding silence reigned, he now paced furiously. His hands, once idle, now itched for vengeance. His heart, once filled with pride, now burned with unbearable grief. Achilles' rage was not solely born of the war itself. It was dictated by the unbearable weight of loss, the agonizing realization of helplessness in the face of a loved one's death, and the understanding that in this there was also his own, albeit indirect, fault. He had left the battle to prove a point, but now that point wounded him too deeply. Achilles had returned to war. However, this was no longer a campaign for honor or pride. It was a funeral in motion. There are moments in mythology when all the fury of war recedes into the background, when the clang of spears, the thundering hooves of horses, and the shouts of battling throngs dissolve into the air, and only a deep, piercing silence remains. And in this silence, something ancient and truly human awakens. Unbearable grief. This was precisely such a moment. The war, of course, still raged. The Achaeans continued to perish in battle. The Trojans still bravely defended their city. But all of it, for the briefest time, became merely a backdrop for the immeasurable grief of a single man. Achilles had just lost Patroclus. To many, Patroclus was merely a companion, his temporary stand-in, a loyal friend. But to Achilles, he meant immeasurably more. He was the link to his humanity. His conscience, a constant reminder that life was not solely about blood and bronze. Their bond was extraordinarily deep, forged not just in the crucible of war, but in moments of laughter, shared memories, and those quiet hours when no one was watching. Many whispered, calling them lovers, while others saw them as brothers in spirit. But on one point all ancient texts concur, and Homer unequivocally sings of it. Achilles harboured the deepest affection for Patroclus, surpassing all other sentiments, and when this invaluable love was cruelly taken from him, with it collapsed everything that had previously held Achilles back from the abyss of despair. Let us begin with the most tragic demise. Patroclus, clad in Achilles' armour, led the Myrmidons into battle, resolutely driving the Trojans from the Greek ships. For a moment, his daring plan worked flawlessly. The Trojans, deceived, believed Achilles himself had returned to the field, and panic swept through their ranks. However, Patroclus, intoxicated by success, disregarded Achilles' stern warning, "Do not approach the gates." But he went there anyway, and there, beneath the majestic walls of Troy, he met his fatal blow. First he was struck by Euphorbus, then the hand of fate intervened, and finally Hector, the valiant prince of Troy, delivered the killing stroke. Hector, stripping the famed armor from Patroclus's body, still unaware of his true identity, triumphantly declared victory. But then, dying on the ground, Patroclus whispered. He told Hector that Achilles would surely come, that his death would not end this conflict, but merely begin it. And so it was. In the Greek camp, Achilles remained waiting, still withdrawn, still embittered, still stubbornly refusing to participate in battles. And then the news arrived. Accounts vary as to who precisely brought him this bitter tidings. In some accounts it was Antilochus, Nestor's son, gasping with inconsolable grief. In others, a chorus of surviving warriors. But the result was immutable. Achilles collapsed. He fell to the ground, scattered dust upon his head, and let out a piercing cry. It was the wail of a man wounded not in flesh, but in soul. A wail that shook not only the tents, but the very gods themselves. His mother, the sea nymph Thetis, rose from the depths. She knew what had happened even before he spoke, but he uttered it none the less. I must return to war. I must kill Hector. I must avenge Patroclus, even if it costs me my own life. For Achilles now understood something terrible. His fate was irrevocably sealed. The choice he once had, a long life or a short but brilliant glory, was no longer his. Patroclus was dead, and only one road remained. But he could not step upon it immediately. First he had to lay his loyal friend to rest. The Greeks, with great difficulty, retrieved Patroclus's body. Hector and the Trojans, ravenous for armor and glory, desperately tried to seize it. But valiant Ajax and Menelaus, among other heroes, bravely repelled their assault. Achilles himself appeared on the battlefield unarmed, and let out such a thunderous roar that the Trojans recoiled in fear. His mere presence turned the tide of battle. Then Thetis, ever the caring and beautiful mother, went to Hephaestus, the divine smith. There, in the crucible of divine flame, new armor was forged, brighter, stronger, and more terrible than before. The centerpiece was a shield, so artfully crafted that it encompassed an entire world. Cities in peace and war, farmers in fields, dancing lovers, stars wheeling. Overhead, it was a reminder, even for Achilles, that there was more to life than mere vengeance, but he donned it nonetheless. And then came the funeral. In Homeric culture, funeral rites were considered sacred. To die without proper ceremony meant to be condemned to eternal wandering in the underworld, tormented by suffering. Achilles vowed not just to bury, but to accord Patroclus the highest honours. They erected a vast and solemn funeral pyre. Sacrifices were made, including, chillingly, 12 Trojan captives, whom Achilles ruthlessly slew in Patroclus's name. Whether it was an act of grief or rage is hard to say, but it was grim and deeply symbolic. Games were also held, chariot races, boxing matches, javelin throws. These were not mere distractions from sorrow. They were acts of remembrance. For the Greeks, excellence in sport was a way to touch the divine. Even in death, Patroclus would be surrounded by honours. Then came the poignant moment when Achilles placed a lock of his own hair into Patroclus's hand, a small gesture yet laden with devastating grief. He whispered promises, and the pyre was lit. Smoke curled into the sky, rising like a soul, and somewhere in that long twilight between myth and memory, Patroclus passed into legend. But Achilles found no peace. He found fury. He fixed his gaze on the walls of Troy, on Hector. It should be noted that Hector did not kill Patroclus out of malice. He was defending his city. At first he had no idea who was inside the armor, but such nuances do not withstand the onslaught of grief. And so Achilles returned to war. He moved like an unquenchable fire. He killed relentlessly. He hunted the Trojans like wild animals. He defied the gods, even Xanthus, the river god of Troy, who pleaded with him to stop polluting his waters with corpses. Achilles refused, and when the river rose in wrath, attempting to drown him, it took the intervention of Hera, Athena, and Hephaestus, who, using fire against flood, pulled Achilles out. Even the gods could barely contain him. And so, at last, Hector and Achilles met. This was no chance skirmish, no fleeting clash on a blood-soaked battlefield. This was the prophesied duel, long awaited and deeply personal. Hector waited outside the gates, knowing this moment was inevitable. He stood not only for Troy, but for every man who fights because he must, not because he wishes to. When Achilles arrived, Hector's courage faltered. He ran. 3 times they circled the walls of Troy. Achilles pursued, Hector fled, until finally Athena, disguised as Hector's brother, tricked him into standing his ground. The 2 warriors clashed, and the fight was swift. Achilles killed Hector, thrusting his spear into his neck. But death was not enough. In one of the most brutal acts of Homeric poetry, Achilles tied Hector's body by the ankles to his chariot and dragged him through the dust around the walls, not once, but again and again. It was a desecration, a defilement. A man of Hector's nobility deserved better, but Achilles was beyond mercy. He dragged the body back to the camp, threw it beside Patroclus's pyre, and left it to rot. For several days the Greeks were silent. Even the gods were disturbed. Then something miraculous happened. King Priam, old, grieving, and unarmed, crept into the Greek camp, guided by Hermes himself, and entered Achilles' tent. There he fell to his knees, kissed the hands that had killed his son, and pleaded not as a king, but as a father. And Achilles, moved by this candor, wept. He saw Priam, and through him Peleus, his own aging father. He saw his future, his fate, his loss. He raised the old man, gave him food, shelter, even comfort. In the silence between them, a certain reverence held sway. They ate. They spoke of fathers, of sons, of things no poem can fully capture. And then, without ceremony, without bargaining, he returned Hector's body. 2 men sat, not as enemies, but as fathers of the dead. For a brief moment, the war stopped. No trumpets, no declarations, just silence. Hector was buried. A great funeral pyre was erected. His wife Andromache grieved. His mother Hecuba wept. Helen too spoke, calling him the only man in Troy who never shamed her. A reminder that even in war, kindness resonates louder than conquest. And so the defender of Troy passed into memory. And Achilles? He knew now that his death was approaching, but for the first time, it didn't matter. He had done what needed to be done, not in battle, but in mercy. It was a transformation. Achilles began as a figure of rage, of untrammeled pride, and here, for one breath of history, he became something else. Not a warrior, not a son of prophecy, but a man who had felt the shape of grief and chosen compassion. The tide had turned, not because the Greeks had won, but because their greatest hero had shown that war was not always about victory. Sometimes it was simply survival. Sometimes it was letting go. Troy still stood. But the walls now seemed thinner, the gods no longer shouted, and Achilles, our brightest, briefest flame, stood on the edge of his destiny. The next arrow had already left the bow. By this point, the sands beneath Troy were soaked with blood, and yet the city still stood. Heroes had come and gone. Gods had taken sides, changed their minds, and sometimes joined the battles themselves. The greatest warrior the Greeks had ever known had returned, avenged his comrade, and for a brief time found a measure of peace. But the end, that distant thunder, was growing louder, and now the war was preparing to make its final turn. Achilles was still on the field, still terrifying, still somehow alive, but not for long. Let us speak of his death, not because it is unexpected, but because it is, in the spirit of Greek myth, terribly anticipated. The gods, especially Apollo, had not forgotten what Achilles had done to Hector. Apollo had watched the dragging of the body, the disregard for the funeral code, the rage that had exceeded mortal bounds. So, when the time came, he lent aid to the most unlikely figure, Paris. Paris was no hero. He was a lover, a charming man, a prince with handsome cheekbones and poor decision-making. But guided by Apollo, he took up a bow. And as Achilles, blazing with victory, came too close to the Scaean gates, Paris loosed an arrow. Some say it struck him in the heel, the single spot Thetis had failed to protect when she dipped him in the Styx. Others say it was the hand of a god that guided the arrow to be fatal. Either way, the effect was the same. Achilles fell. No grand speeches, no lingering goodbyes, just the fall of a man who had burned too brightly for too long. The Greeks plunged into mourning, and then, as often happens after great losses, began a fierce dispute over the right to inherit Achilles' armour. This armour was truly priceless, forged by Hephaestus himself, and every element of it shone with divine craftsmanship. Two laid claim to this great honour: Ajax the Great, son of Telamon, a man of immense strength, unwavering integrity, and boundless loyalty, and Odysseus, son of Laertes, renowned for his intellect, cunning comparable to the divine, and eloquence capable of persuading anyone. To resolve this dispute, a contest was arranged, where the Greeks carefully listened to the speeches of each claimant. Ajax, in his address, emphasized his martial deeds and bravery, while Odysseus focused on the subtleties of strategy and tactical superiority. Ultimately, the armor was awarded to Odysseus, the man who knew how to turn words into formidable weapons. Ajax was devastated by this decision. He, who had fought bravely, carried Achilles' body from the battlefield, who had stood firm when others faltered, was now bypassed, yielding to an eloquent tactician. His honour, so intimately linked with his might and valour, crumbled to dust. In the dead of night, Ajax lost his mind. He began to slaughter sheep, seeing them as his enemies. When his sanity returned and he realized the extent of his madness, he took his own life, plunging his sword into himself. Thus fell another hero, not in the thick of battle, but in the depths of despair. The Greeks, with reverent silence, committed his body to the flames. Even in those times, suicide was an act fraught with complex moral dilemmas. Honor and shame were forever intertwined in this tragedy. And Troy, despite all these losses, still stood. By this point, the war had become a tragic spectacle, with hero after hero falling. Even the gods, it seemed, began to withdraw, perhaps embarrassed by the consequences of their own actions. The Greeks, having exhausted all other means, turned to prophecies, which was always the last resort when all else failed. According to the seers' predictions, 3 key conditions had to be met for Troy to fall. First, Achilles' son had to join the battle beneath Troy's walls. Second, the Greeks had to retrieve Heracles' bow. And third, the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena, had to be removed from the city. Seemingly straightforward, right? So they set out to find Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, also known as Pyrrhus. Raised far from the horrors of war, he was young, inexperienced, and possessed that aggressive self-assurance unique to adolescence. When Odysseus found him and brought him to the Greeks, Neoptolemus agreed to join the war, driven not so much by a sense of duty as by a feeling of his own destiny. He was to finish what his father had started. Then it was time for Philoctetes. Philoctetes was a sore subject for the Greeks. Years earlier, on the way to Troy, he had been bitten by a snake, and the wound had festered, oozing and emitting an unbearable stench. The Greeks, never known for their particular sensitivity, had simply abandoned him on the island of Lemnos. With him they had left Heracles' bow, the only weapon prophesied to bring down Troy. The charming Odysseus returned to Philoctetes, full of apologies. Philoctetes, naturally, was furious. But after much persuasion and promises of heroic redemption, he agreed. The bow returned to the war. Prophecy, piece by piece, was beginning to unfold. The third task required stealth and cunning. The Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena, served as Troy's unbreakable safeguard. As long as it remained in the city, Troy could not fall. Odysseus and Diomedes, displaying incredible daring, slipped into Troy under the cloak of night, scaled the walls, and stole it. There were no bright flashes, no triumphant fanfares, just 2 men accomplishing what entire armies could not. And now, at last, Troy was vulnerable. Yet it was still not defeated. And then came the great deception. The Greeks, led by Odysseus, constructed a colossal wooden horse, a hollow structure artfully carved to appear as a gift to the goddess Athena. They left it at Troy's gates and sailed away, or so it seemed. The Trojans discovered it, gripped by confusion, curiosity, and heated debate. Some, like Laocoön, warned against the gift. "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," he famously uttered, before being rather dramatically devoured by sea serpents. The gods were not subtle in their hints. Others, like Sinon, a Greek left behind and feigning desertion, spun an artful tale of sacrifice, of atonement, and of the war's end. The horse, he claimed, would bring blessings to Troy, and the Trojans, weary and full of hope, dragged it inside the city walls. What followed was a long night of widespread revelry. After a decade-long siege, the Trojans finally had cause for celebration. Fires were lit, wine flowed, songs were sung, and the people of Troy, weary but joyful, genuinely believed the war was over. But war, as it often does, had one more final act. In the night, the Greeks' returned. From the wooden horse emerged the warriors, Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, and other heroes. They threw open the city gates. The Greek army, hidden on a nearby island, poured into the city. Chaos was instantaneous. Temples burned, families fled in terror. The clang of bronze echoed through the narrow streets. Priam, the aging king, was cut down at the altar of Zeus by Neoptolemus himself. This act, even in the blood-soaked economy of war, was considered a monstrous atrocity. Hecuba, his queen, was taken captive. She would spend the rest of her life as a servant in the house of her enemies. Her transformation from queen to slave, from a symbol of Troy's grandeur to an emblem of its ruin, was not unique. The women of Troy shared her sorrowful fate. Andromache, Hector's wife and mother of Astyanax, was also enslaved. Her son fared worse. The Greeks, fearing he might one day rise to avenge his father, hurled him from the walls. In the ancient world, such acts were both pragmatic and horrifying. Hector's lineage was ruthlessly extinguished. The fates of the women were extensively detailed in later tragedies. Cassandra, the doomed prophetess, was dragged from the temple of Athena by Ajax the Lesser. She clung to the statue, seeking divine protection. Nothing helped. She became Agamemnon's concubine, a prize he would soon regret. Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships, was finally found by Menelaus. Some accounts claim he intended to kill her. Others say she uttered but a single word and let her clothing fall from her shoulders. Either way, she survived, and Menelaus took her home, because war was always more complicated than it seemed. Now, let us turn to the Greek side. They had won. The city was sacked. The spoils were theirs. And yet, it was not a clean victory. Greek religion placed immense importance on ritual sacrifices and proper conduct before the gods. But during the sack of Troy, these boundaries were transgressed. Temples were plundered, altars defiled with blood, sacred sites desecrated, and for these transgressions the gods would not remain silent. Storms arose. The journey home for many Greeks would prove longer and more perilous than the war itself. Agamemnon, the High King, returned to Mycenae only to be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra. She had not forgotten the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia, offered to appease Artemis at the war's outset. Nor had she been idle with Aegisthus, her lover in Agamemnon's absence. Cassandra died with him, foreseeing everything, but powerless to stop any of it. Menelaus and Helen were tossed across the Mediterranean, landing in Egypt. It took them years to find their way back to Sparta, and even when they did, the shadow of the war never truly left them. Helen's reputation in later Greek thought was, at best, ambivalent. To some, she was the embodiment of beauty and longing. To others, she was the ultimate cautionary tale, a woman who brought empires to ruin simply by existing. As for Odysseus, his story became legend. The Odyssey chronicles a 10-year voyage marked by monsters, sorceresses, seductive singers, and the wrath of Poseidon. Each episode is rich with symbolism. The Cyclops Polyphemus represents the dangers of unchecked brute force. the sorceress Circe, the temptation of comfort over duty, the sirens, knowledge without consequence. And yet, despite all his trials, it is not brute strength, but cunning, endurance, and restraint that bring Odysseus home. However, even he, the hero of twists and turns, finds no easy welcome. Penelope, his wife, is faithful but besieged by suitors. His son, Telemachus, is nearly grown. His palace is full of strangers, feasting at his expense and mocking his name. The homecoming is not a triumph. It is a reintegration. And that is never easy. The concept of a painful homecoming, known as nostos, became central to the treasury of Greek literature. Though the destructive war in Troy had concluded, its echoes continued to resonate not only in the scarred souls of the warriors, but also in the devastated lands they eventually stepped upon. Heavy memories, deep traumas, and the relentless burden of the legends forged around them remained constant companions. The ancient Greeks well understood that any victory invariably came with a high price, and this reckoning often manifested in oppressive silence, unsettling anxiety, and the tormenting nightmares that haunted those who survived. Meanwhile, for the Trojans, a vastly different fate awaited, one imbued with flight and hope. Aeneas, valiant Hector's cousin, and one of the few Trojan leaders to survive the war's inferno, fled the burning city, bearing his aged father Anchises on his shoulders, and carefully leading his young son Ascanius by the hand. Guided by prophetic visions and fate itself, he carried Troy's household gods with him, thus preserving his people's sacred heritage in exile. This epic became a symbol not only of physical survival, but also of a remarkable cultural rebirth. His grand journey, masterfully immortalized in Virgil's timeless Aeneid, traversed the vast expanse of the Mediterranean, where he had to overcome fierce storms, resist cunning temptations, and wage grueling wars until his ship finally landed on the shores of Italy,